So I have the enormous pleasure of introducing Girish Karnad and Sudhir Kakar. Some of you might think that I follow Girish Karnad around. It's true, I do. Every time he does a session, I have the pleasure of introducing him. Girish is, of course, one of our most important, most successful, and louder. Girish Karnad is one of our most...
No, that won't be louder. You just have to speak louder.
Speak louder. It is my pleasure to introduce this evening Girish Karnad and Sudhir Kakar. Girish is, of course, one of our most successful, most influential, and most effective playwrights. Sudhir Kakar's work we know through the examination of the Indian psyche. Today they're both going to talk about examining themselves, examining their lives. So what we're going to do is, they're both going to read from their new works. Both of them have written autobiographies. So we'll let them talk for a little bit, we'll let them read for a little bit, and then I will ask a few pertinent questions, and then you will ask some pertinent questions. We have just about 60 minutes, so let's get started. Girish?
Thank you. I promise you, Sudhir and I didn't conspire to have a program now so that we would have such a captive audience. You know. Many of you may be here because you can't get out from the earlier, well, which is nice, of course. Can you turn off the screens, please? Because if I'm on the screen, I only look at myself. That's my profession. The question, we are talking about memoirs and autobiographies, and the question arises, which is often been, I've just recently published a book of memoirs in Kannada. It's called Adartha Ayushya, which can't be translated into English, but can be translated into Hindi as something like Khelte Khelte Zindagi. And that is a line from the famous poet D.R. Bendre, who is a Marathi speaker but became the greatest Kannada poet. And well, my memoirs are about that, and I have often been asked, when did you decide that you wanted to write your autobiography? There are several moments, I think, but one moment is, I think, when my wife said to me, do you realize you have started name dropping? You know, where every time I started something, I would say, you know, as I said to Satyajit Ray, or as I said to Ravi Shankar, or, you know, some big name like that. And then I started thinking whether this was just a vanity or something more to it. And I must say that, of course, every age thinks of itself as a great age. But I think I was very lucky to be born when I was born, which was in 1938. That was 9 years before independence. So I was just there in the first decade of independence, watching things happen. A new nation come up, the economy, you know, the arts flourishing, the idealism of the earlier generation of national leaders who were trying to build a whole nation. Then in the 50s came the films of Satyajit Ray, which opened up a completely new vision of the Indian cinema to the West. In the 60s, it's almost decade by decade. In the 60s, we get theater, Alkazi's theater in the National School of Drama and the people he created and sent. Then in the 70s and the 80s comes the first, what I consider the first generation of Indian intellectuals. I mean, Sudhir is one of them, Ashish Nandi, there is Romila Thapar, Irfan Habib, one can go on, there's so many of them. To me, it was exciting to be growing up when around one, there were young people who were thinking, who were very much aware, they were not quoting Upanishads, I mean, they were very much aware of what's happening in the West, and yet could apply it to the Upanishads or to their own background and were making things possible. Then in the 80s, television came. So I then decided, yes, I was very lucky because I was party to this growing up. As each decade opened, a new technological development, a new artistic development took place in India, and I was there, fortunately, because I was born when I was born. And I was talking to my son about this, and I said, you know, in the 50s, the film started, in the 60s, when I was there, in early 50s, film started, in the 60s, theater opened, in the 70s, there was this intellectual thing, in the 80s, there was television, but in the 90s, everything came to a stop. And my young son said, no, everything didn't come to a stop, electronics came, but you don't understand it, that's all. So I'll stop there. The point I want to make about my autobiography is that I wanted to write about the age I was born in because I wanted to celebrate it. When I look back, I think I was extraordinarily lucky with the people I worked with. But when I sat down to write my memoirs, it started with an autobiography written by my mother at the age of 82. I'll come to it when we come to it. Thank you. Sudhir.
I'm glad that they've been turned off, because when they are turned on, I watch the others. Because there's this well-known story about a psychoanalyst is someone, when a beautiful girl comes in the room, everyone watches the beautiful girl, he's watching the others. So that is what I do. So my question is about self-examination in the writing of memoirs. Self-examination in the writing of memoirs is about choosing one's memories and the courage one has in making the choices. Without courage, one can easily become the kind of memoirist who drapes a flag of achievements around the shoulders and jogs around the memory track, which is a boring kind of a memoirist. In my own ambition to write a different kind of memoir, a memoir which, in Mark Twain's words, is as uninhibited, free, and intimate as a love letter, I discovered that there were times when the press to conceal was much stronger than the wish to reveal. And it was at those times I really appreciated someone's remark that one should write an autobiography after one's dead. Why is self-examination so difficult? I think the reason is simple, because self-examination is preeminently an exploration of self-deception. In the writing of memoir, one becomes aware of the evasions and the rationalizations and the omissions of an undertaking whose the one commandment is that everything you're writing about and the narration of your memories should not deal really any real damage to one's feelings of self-worth. You may have some small pinpricks to your narcissism, but thou shalt not grievously wound your narcissism. That seems to be a commandment in the writing of memoirs, which one has to struggle against, which is a very, very difficult struggle. If anyone who is attempted to write a memoir knows, you do say this Ray and Ravi Shankar when I met you. That is a temptation. And Girish Karnad, yes. And I'm, of course, no exception to the rule that people are fairly accurate in their perception of others, but have a distorted perception of themselves. I mean, that is a rule of which I am also no exception to. But once a memoirist gives free reins to memory, I think there should be no corners, no nooks which should be hidden from its visitations. And it is in the remembrance, I think, of one's loves, childhood, adult loves, where the danger of varying and misrepresentations of the past is most acute. And yet to keep the most valuable part of oneself, myself, or as I believe of any other human being, hidden from the view, I think, is fatal to the intention of these memoirs. If it is only our memories, the stories we tell ourselves and to others that constitute our identity, then there's one particular class of memories which is central to making sense of who we are. Except for the spiritually gifted, the mystics who believe there is a true self beyond memory, that they've glimpsed such a true self. For most of us, the truth about ourself is laid bare by memories of loves that evoked our deepest emotions. And at the end, of course, when you come to it, you never really know how it all came about. I think our lives are led by unconscious forces, and we only think that we have nudged or given some direction at their folks. We really don't know how it all came about. And the title of my memoir is A Book of Memory. It could have been easily a book of life, because I think at the end that is all what life is, a collection of memories.
Well, I'll read a small section, short section from the first chapter of my book of memoirs, which is called, as I said, in Kannada, Khelte Khelte Zindagi. My mother's name was Krishnabai Mankikar, but she was Kutabai to the elders in the family and became Kutaka to those younger than her. In 1984, when she was 82, my sister-in-law Sunanda persuaded her to write down her autobiography. It's about 30 pages long, written in Konkani, jotted down in an old diary of my father's, in spaces left blank after he had scribbled his daily accounts. Until we read that account, my siblings and I had struggled to somehow come to terms with the many anxieties and nightmares that had disturbed our childhood nights. Her autobiography helped to resolve the fears by bringing them out in the open and dealing with them forthrightly. When she came of age, Kutabai was still unmarried, and the family, after desperate attempts at concealing this shameful fact from relatives and neighbors, and pretending from month to month that everything was just normal, ultimately found a boy from the Gokarn family. She was married, a son was born to her, Bhalchandra, and within a couple of years her husband died of anemia and malaria. Her parents-in-law did not bother to visit her. Except for the jewelry given to me by my father, she writes, I did not possess a penny. There was a life insurance policy, but that too lapsed, and no one had bothered to pay the installments. Thus started her peregrinations with a son on her waist and no future to look forward to. All this was, and continues to be, the common fate of widows from the more deprived sections of the middle class in India. Fortunately, by 1920s, the Chitrapur Saraswat Brahmin community, to which I belong, had abandoned the custom of shaving their widows. So Kutabai's long hair, which when loosened tumbled down to her knees, was spared the barber's scissors. Even in this desperate situation, Kutabai was determined to educate herself, to achieve something of significance in her life, if possible, become a doctor. Gadag was in the backwoods of the Bombay state, that's where she lived, but Pune and Bombay were across the border, no more than a day's journey away by train. But no one in her family had either the inclination or the time to accompany her across the border to these cities and get her admitted into an educational institute. The one person who came to her help at this moment was Sashital Mangesh Rao, her elder sister's husband, who was a mamletdar, that was an official, a revenue official in the government of service. First in Haveri, then in Dharwad. His house was like a huge orphanage in which, apart from a shelter for several orphaned people, often only distantly related. Mangesh Rao was obsessed with getting this entire brood properly educated. A teacher would arrive early in the morning to provide tuition in Sanskrit. Then again, even as the children reached home from school in the evening, another teacher would present himself at the doorsteps. Besides, Mangesh Rao himself was a keen and enthusiastic teacher. My mother writes, I sat down to study with the children. Since I loved studying, I reached the English post-standard class within 5 or 6 months. Algebra, fractions, time, work and speed. There was a subject called Sanskrit translation which I mastered, and I decided to appear for matriculation from home. In those days, it was enough to be a matriculate to get admission into the medical college, and I was desperate to become a doctor. But Mangesh Rao was transferred to a village where there were no educational facilities, and again, Kutabai had to move to a place with these children with a temporary arrangement. Then, I'll read out exactly what she writes. My brother-in-law often used to visit Belgaum for his work in the courts. He was a mamletdar after all. On those visits, he would stay with a relative of ours called Dr. Raghunath Karnad. While there, he saw the nurses working in the hospital, and a brainwave of sending me there to train myself as one. He asked the doctor whether I would be admitted to the nursing course. The doctor agreed. I protested that I wanted to go in for medicine and become a doctor. But my brother-in-law argued that I could continue my studies while training to be a nurse and appear for the exams. He even said he would fix a teacher to tutor me. He got me admitted to a year's midwifery course and went away. In our entire family, he was the only person willing to help me, so I had no choice but to listen to him. I had neither money nor jewelry. When I joined the nursing course in Belgaum, the problem of accommodation came up. I used to get a scholarship of ₹20 per month. But the hospital had quarters only for the head nurses, and Kutabai had to fend for herself and find a place to live. Dr. Karnad said I could stay in his house. Thus, I had no alternative but to accept the doctor's offer. The doctor's wife suffered from I don't know what disease. She was chronically bedridden, no bathing, no getting up, moving about. Next to her was a stool on which food was kept. We had a nurse to look after her, and there was a cook. The doctor was very good looking to look at. Nearly 6 foot tall, curly hair, fair complexion, with a gait that would attract anyone, a figure that was neither fat nor thin. He wore a hat to the hospital, as a result of which people often mistook him for an Anglo-Indian. He was about 34, 35 then. It was at that time that the doctor asked me if I had any idea of remarriage. And the thoughts started burrowing in my brain. I was all of 21 then. Thus began Kutabai's 5 years in the doctor's house. The 5 years that lacerated me and my siblings during our teenage years. It is true that ultimately they got married. But what was the nature of the relationship during these 5 years? Could it have been sexual? The very thought that our mother might have lived in sin with a married man, never mind that that man was our father, was painful in the extreme. When we were in the teens, if I even remotely suggested they may have occasionally slept together, my sisters would fly into a rage and burst into tears. Her autobiography gave forthright answers to our obsessive worries and did much to calm our anxieties. What continues to amaze me and intrigue me, however, is the reasoning that persuaded her brother-in-law, Mangesh Rao, to dump a beautiful young widow in the arms of a 35-year-old married man so casually and disappear. What norms guiding life in the Hindu society of those days provided this pillar of the society with a justification for this most unusual action? Tell me if I overrun my time. He could not have assumed that the situation would automatically end up in marriage, as indeed it did. Could he have assumed that the sense of propriety and restraint innate to all members of the Saraswat Brahmin community would keep these two young people away from each other? Or did he just decide that he had a hopeless situation on his hands, that the widow had no future, that he couldn't go on wasting his time on her? Whatever the case, Mangesh Rao proved the Purana Purusha, the ancient sage of our family. For 5 years, the doctors did not follow up his proposal. Bigamy was not illegal in those days, my mother writes. There were several men in Maharashtra who had 4 or 5 wives, but the doctor was scared of public opinion. She does not explain what his fears were, but it is evident that whatever held him back was not the thought of bigamy as the fear of precipitating a scandal by marrying a widow. She finished her nursing in 3 years and began hunting for a job. She traveled to distant places. She went as far as Bangalore to a large hospital, but returned because her English was not up to the standards required by the staff there. This going out in search of a job only to return empty-handed to Belgaum, back to the shelter provided by the doctor, became the recurrent motive of her life. Our intimacy had grown. I had begun to find the public sniping impossible to bear. Another year passed, and still the doctor showed no inclination to proceed any further. It was then that I decided to take the lead. I confronted him with the fact that I had suffered enough poisonous gossip for his sake and demanded to know if he was now going to let me down halfway down the road. I insisted that he should get himself transferred to another posting, presumably so remote that the scandal of a widow remarriage wouldn't reach them there. The doctor's reluctance was simply the result of his usual diffidence. The principle he drummed into us, his children, always emphasized the necessity for caution at every step and the advantages of not being too adventurous. Ultimately, they married to Bombay separately to a Vaidya who performed the wedding according to a Vedic ritual, and who had arranged everything, including the Mangal Sutra. There, she writes, with an audible sigh of relief, at long last we got married with a fire as the witness. Only I know the mental torture I had endured during those 5 years. But from the moment they got married, the doctor and Krishnabai launched on the enterprise of wiping out the smallest sign, the remotest memory of her history prior to the marriage. I need not mention that Krishnabai Gokarn became Krishnabai Karnad, since she would have had to experience the transformation even if she was Krishnabai Mankekar. But after their marriage, the doctor got himself transferred from Dharwar to a remote town of Bagalkot to ensure that the past was kept firmly out and they could start life afresh. The nursing certificates of Krishnabai Gokarn remained unframed and were rolled up and locked up in dusty old trunks. The notebooks and books which carried her name lost their front pages or vanished entirely. Thus, these two people, who had shown the courage to challenge Hindu orthodoxy and shake contemporary society to its core, acted as though it was they that were the guilty party and attempted to slink away into the distance to escape the eyes of the public. If this great plan to wipe out the past, the doctor's first wife, in this great plan to wipe out the past, the doctor's first wife naturally vanishes without a trace. The last paragraph, I won't go on for too long. But the history which my parents had hoped to bury safely behind them continued to pursue us, children, whispering, winking its eyes, swirling around us in various guises. Since our parents never took us in their confidence about their past, our childhoods were made miserable by the nightmare that some mysterious, unbearable happening, something that needed to be concealed from us as well as from the prying eyes of our neighbors, was at the bottom of our parenthood, of our parents. One day, as I passed a group of women in Sirsi, sitting gossiping in a courtyard, a woman asked me, "Why is your father so much older than your mother?" And those around her suppressed their smirk with such evident glee that the question sprouted all kinds of imaginary horns and fangs. My sister was informed that Bhalchandra, that's my eldest brother, was not her natural brother, but a step-brother by a girl of her own age employed to look after my younger sister. She apparently cried for days in a corner, hiding her face. A boy of my own age in my class gravely informed me, "My grandmother knows all the facts and she has told me, when your mother was getting married for the first time, the Mangal Sutra in her hand turned into a live snake. When she dropped it to the floor, it bit the bridegroom and disappeared. He died instantly. For nights thereafter, I was planning the various tortures I would inflict on him when I grew up, chopping him into little pieces limb by limb. But who was there to turn to? In 1948, father finally retired to a community where everyone knew us. It was Saraswat Brahmin neighborhood. I asked a boy slightly older than me about mine. He gave me the facts in 5 minutes straight, and I heaved a sigh of relief. I was 14 then. If instead of making such an effort to blind us to our history, our parents had told us the plain truth, we children would have had a less tortured childhood. In this stormy epic of my mother's married life, the person who was tossed about was my eldest brother, Bhalachandra. So you see, every tale has a tale which has never been tied up. So I'll leave it at that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Girish. That was wonderful. Sudhir?
I'll read short vignettes from various times of my life. So the first one is, I'm 9 years old. The year 1947 was the site of my first literary foray, a radio play written in Urdu that I sent off to All India Radio, AIR, in Delhi. I have no memory of the content of the play or its length, perhaps around 10 pages to fit the 15-minute slot that was allotted to these plays. I've never felt so as proud as I did on the day I received the printed formal letter from AIR regretting that they were unable to use the play while wishing me success in my future literary endeavors. That first acknowledgement, never mind that it was a rejection, was more exhilarating than any publisher's acceptance of a manuscript in later life. For days I went around school with the rejection letter in my pocket, reading and rereading it, showing it to incurious friends, till it fell apart after being left in the pocket of a shirt thrown in the wash before I could retrieve it. This is 21-year-old first visit outside India into Europe. A few years ago, a German television interview asked me about what had struck me most when I first arrived in Germany. The country was in the middle of an unprecedented economic growth, the Wirtschaft Wunder, and what struck me most, I said, was how Hamburg, a city that was 90% destroyed by Allied bombing, had been rebuilt within 14 years of the end of the war. I was struck by the newly restored facades of the public buildings and grand merchant houses. I went on to say, by the profusion of consumer goods I'd never seen in India, and most of all by the real German miracle, a political democratization that obliterated all signs of the recent Nazi dictatorship. My answer was a lie, a hypocritical nod to the persona of the gray-haired, eminent Indian psychoanalyst and writer that the interviewer was addressing. What fascinated and suffused the 21-year-old with delicious erotic warmth in the first couple of months of his arrival was the sight of young women's slim bare legs on the streets of Hamburg. The tantalizing glimpse of a thigh when a sudden breeze lifted the summer frock before the flustered girl could smooth it down again was an added bonus. This was not a simple matter of getting sexual kicks from the sight of naked female flesh. Bare midriffs, for instance, the expanse between the end of the blouse and beginning of the sari, were a common sight in India. I had never given a second look to the village women on the streets of Jaipur or the Rabari women in Ahmedabad, whose wispy cholis bared not only the midriff but also the back. Bare backs and midriffs were not exciting. Legs were, because they were covered. This is, of course, a short vignette from an encounter which really changed my life. And this is an encounter with the psychoanalyst Erik Erikson, widely regarded as one of the most influential psychoanalysts after Freud. His book, Gandhi's Truth, long ago won both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. I was unaware of Erikson's stature when I met him in 1964, and in fact confused his name with that of Erich Fromm, who was better known in the lay reading public. I could therefore approach him naturally, without an inhibiting awe. Whenever I was back in Ahmedabad from my travels, I loved to go across to his house at sunset after he had finished his own work. We would sit outside on the balcony overlooking the Sabarmati. In companionable silence, we would sip at a gin and tonic and contemplate the vista of an age-old life unfolding on the riverbed. We watched and talked of Gandhi and of the men and women whose lives he had transformed. Like Gandhi, Erikson was no mean transformer himself. His sparse observations were full of insights and gentle humor that captivated me. What struck me most about him was a benevolence singularly free from all traces of condescension, whether of the old towards the young, the learned towards the ignorant, the established scholar towards the novice, or the famous towards the unknown. He had that rarest of gifts, a possession of the truly generous in spirit, of paying complete and total attention to the person he was with, even when what the person was saying was neither particularly original nor especially interesting. I do not remember the details of the conversations we carried out in German, a language that was his mother tongue but which he really got to speak. But their spirit is still alive within me. The way he looked at people and events, with that indefinable quality called wisdom, was opening up my mind and my spirit in a way I had never experienced before. It was not as if he talked a great deal. He was not one of those people who infest public life and our television screens, who hold forth at length, afflicting our ears and violating our sensibility with banalities. Erikson was quite capable of listening to my callow views on Gandhi and on life with a grave courtesy and responding in a way which never made me feel that he did not take them or me seriously. Many years later, I saw this quality again and again in his seminars. Even if, according to my lights, someone was spouting forth nonsense, Erikson would paraphrase the person in a way that made the contribution seem valuable, a value he added himself. Time and again, I saw the delighted surprise on the face of a student. Did I say this? Everyone who attended a seminar with Erickson or talked to him went away with a sense of enhancement, never of being diminished. I believe it was this innate generosity of spirit which made him pay attention to me. I was 26 years old, lonely, desperately longing to return to Europe and to stay in India, full of the most outrageous plans for my life, wanting to do so many things because I did not know the one thing I really wanted to do. I read his writings, Childhood and Society, Young Man Luther, Insight and Responsibility, initially with curiosity and later with mounting excitement. I discovered that my own inner confusion was perhaps not symptom of a mental disorder, as I had secretly feared, but something many people have gone through in their lives. My identity problems, though perhaps unduly prolonged, belong to a normative crisis of adolescence and young adulthood, where my idiosyncratic gifts demanded but had not found a corresponding occupational setting. My identity confusion, in addition, was not only personal, but was also located in the cultural of my community, in the sense that it reflected the contemporary crisis in the development of the Indian middle class, torn between East and West, conflicted between European and Indian worldviews. Put simply, I was having an identity crisis. It was my good fortune that I could spend so many hours with the person who had coined the term. What happened to me at the age of 26 had many elements of a conversion experience. I discovered that what I really wanted was that special kind of life of the mind that I believed psychoanalysis could give me. I wanted to be like him, a writing psychoanalyst. It was to his credit that he did not laugh out aloud when I told him of his adoption as my mentor and my intention to work with him when he returned to his job as professor of human development at Harvard. My degrees in engineering and economics were my only formal qualifications. But as he knew, I had published short stories in German. Gravely, but with a twinkle in his eye, he pointed out the vital flaw in my plan to work with him in his course on the human life cycle. "You have never studied psychology," he said. I could only nod my assent to this intrusion of reality. "It doesn't matter," he said, "neither have I." For although later in life he was to be showered with honorary doctorates from universities all over the world, his only formal education qualification was graduation from high school and a Montessori diploma. He had never studied at a university and had spent his Wanderjahre, the wandering years in Europe, as what he called a non-functioning artist, sketching and wood engraving before he came to Vienna to Freud's household and became the art teacher of the children. I like to believe that across the gulf in our ages, cultures, and ethnicities, he sensed in me a kindred spirit whose travel through life was not destined to be in a straight line, but to take a zigzag course that would often deviate from the main road to explore by-lanes with marvelous unexpected vistas, even when some of these ultimately turned out to be dead ends. "I like your stories though. They show a psychological mindedness, and that is sufficient for me," he said. Here Erickson was acting in the spirit of Freud, whose selection of men and women who became the first generation of psychoanalysts was dictated by the criteria that all they needed was to be prepared by a general erudition and gifted with a certain perceptiveness for the non-rational. Quote Freud, which means that they had to be both sane enough to survive such dangerous dealings with the uncharted inner world and just odd enough to want to study it. I remember that some 3 decades later, I quoted this statement to a good friend, the poet-scholar A.K. Ramanujan, who had been in a depressed state for a couple of years before his tragic death, when he asked me whether he could formally study psychoanalysis without having a medical or a psychological background. "I'll tell you what I'll do," Erickson went on to say. "If you get your doctorate in the next 2 to 3 years, I'll try my best to get you to Harvard to work with me." We shook hands as I once again bade him goodbye. This is in the 40s, again an encounter with the philosopher Krishnamurti at Mr. Popal Jaikar, who was the unofficial culture minister for Mrs. Indira Gandhi. Krishnamurti stayed with her whenever he came to Delhi, and during one such visit, she invited me and 5 other Delhi intellectuals for a conversation with him. Krishnamurti was a thoroughly modern guru, although he disliked that appellation, who had distilled the essence of Upanishadic and Buddhist wisdom and could convey it with rare eloquence. His magnetic personality, iconoclastic attitude toward established religions, and emphasis on reason than belief made him enjoy huge success with the more intellectual and higher placed sections of society. He was not one of those gurus who hid his own humanity behind an armor of spiritual impermeability and the mask of a saint. He liked expensive cars and gourmet food, and as I later read in a biography, had a long-term relation with his Ojai retreat in California with the American wife of his confidant, editor, manager, and fundraiser, Raj Gopal. One of Krishnamurti's biographers points out that the problems he talked of with such deep understanding of fear and its relation to death, ambition, and insecurity were the ones he struggled with all his life. Here, I do not share his biographer's implicit judgment that a personal, life historical connection diminishes the value of his teachings or renders them suspect. Every great philosophy, Nietzsche wrote, is a species of involuntary and unconscious autobiography. In the case of some scholars and scientists, he adds, there really may be such a thing as an impulse to knowledge, some kind of small, independent clockwork, which, when well wound up, works away industriously to that end. I would go further and add that the work not only the philosopher, but also the artist, the writer, and of many a creative scholar in the humanities is inspired by the fundamental impulses of their nature and are embedded in and have been shaped by the course of their lives. I believe that original work takes place only when the area of inquiry carved out by the individual in his own, as his own, resonate with the major themes of his or her life that are played out below the surface of his conscious awareness. Insights dawn and are more often one's lot when the work is but an unconscious continuation of one's inner theater, of one's biography in another register. I remember that Krishnamurti began with a short disquisition on his favorite subject, the origin of fear in human thought, before turning to us with, "Do you agree, sir?" This was the sage's method of teaching, asking a question and then going on to expound his ideas before asking another question. I was not conversant with this process. As a fledgling analyst committed to the Freudian edifice, I enthusiastically proceeded to correct the sage, giving the standard explanation of the various kinds of anxieties during infancy and childhood, loss of the needed and beloved caretaker, loss of the caretaker's love, the fear of punishment by internalized caretakers, unmindful that people had come to hear him and not me. Krishnamurti suddenly interrupted me by pointing a finger towards the roof of the house behind me. "Look at that beautiful bird." Necks swiveled, there were oohs and ahs, while I subsided into an embarrassed mumble. By pointing to the bird, enabling a shift in the consciousness of the audience, the mystic had again exposed the hollowness of a purely intellectual discourse. I was mortified. My own listening now became adversarial. Fear, he said, further arises when you compare yourself with someone who's higher, with someone who is what you are not. You want to become him and not be what you are. No, you don't, I was silently saying to myself. What you do when you envy is to look at all the faults and shortcomings of the other person. You do not envy someone you can disparage. I was unaware that I was doing the same to Krishnamurti. But envy does sharpen perception, even if the perception is one-sided, of the warts and chinks of the armor of the envied person and not of his beauty, wisdom, or accomplishment. After the talk was over, a dozen of us were invited inside by Mrs. Jaipur to a private lunch. I walked into the house behind Krishnamurti, watching him slow down in front of every mirror he passed, smoothing back a wispy lock of grey hair. He was in good form throughout the lunch, regaling us with stories of fast driving in sports cars and the wonderful restaurants in California and Switzerland where he had many followers. I was quiet as I listened to him, penetrating insights interspersed with human, all-too-human bragging. I began to like him better as I began to sense a man divided within himself, the sage existing in the same body and mind with a vain youth and a fearful child. Looking back, I now regret that my mortification and yes, envy that sought to reduce his stature prevented me from being more receptive to what he had to offer, to profit from a rare encounter with a highly charismatic and wise man. Later, when I read a few of his published conversations, I found that I often agreed with him. In his stark view of the reality of human life and the world in which it is embedded, he was nearer a depressive Freud and the Buddha rather than the optimistic purveyors, Western psychotherapists or Indian gurus of a possible psychic transformation that ensures a permanent dwelling in the land of happiness. Krishnamurti was certainly no promiser of rose gardens. I think I should end there.
Thank you. Request from Girish, is it possible to dim those lights because we
can't see
anybody? Thank you, thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, both very much. Two things struck me when you were reading. One, of course, is that how, thank you very much. Oh, that's lovely. Just a little bit lower? Yeah. Great. Is that better?
That's good. No light here. Okay, anyway.
One, of course, is that your lives are coincident with the life of the nation. You are both about 10 years older than India is. And I'm wondering if the urge to tell one story that you both display, to tell the story of one's life, is perhaps something that's also happening in India, that we are, as a nation, choosing to tell our story again. That's one thing. And the other thing is I find it absolutely charming and very exciting that both of you, Girish opens his autobiography with a sort of exploration of a hidden sexuality, your mother's sexuality, and very early in your autobiography you mention how exciting it was to see legs. Also sexual, yeah.
That was just an appetizer. I mean, there's much.
I'm sure there is, yeah. But I'm going to reverse the questions. Typically, one would expect that we'd ask Sudhir to respond to questions of sexuality and Girish to respond to questions of the nation. So I'm going to reverse it, and I'm going to ask Girish just, to maybe meditate on that a little bit, how your autobiography, well, yours, this idea of how important sexuality becomes in the examination of oneself, whether it's one's own sexuality or the sexuality of those around us. And then I'd like Sudhir to talk about the idea of, are we as India, as a nation, are we ready to tell our story? So
let me first answer the second question.
I'll tell it to you again. Yeah.
Well, the whole notion that the history of the nation is in some way a metaphor for my own life, or the other way around, that my life is a metaphor for the history of the notion. This whole idea was stolen by Salman Rushdie in Midnight Children, so made it impossible for one to write up. He did it so brilliantly, so I'm quite happy not to talk about that. About sexuality, the point is I can't really write as sensitively as Sudhir has written. He has talked to different people and so on. But as I discovered, in fact, one of the things that everyone compliments me in this autobiography I've written is how open I have been about my difficulties with sex. Because, in India first there is a great hypocrisy. No one talks about it, you're brought up to believe, that everyone notion. Then in South Indian families, certainly you can marry your uncle's daughter. Your first cousin. So what happens is that when you are growing up, I was surrounded by 5 cousins, and one wasn't sure whether they were meant to be my wives or my cousins. You see, and there was this continual sliding in our relationship between, being the sympathetic, cold-shouldered man, or was she sort of hinting that I am obliged to marry her, or at least pet her, whatever it is. This continued in my 30s, and the complete openness with regard to sex is still not there, as a result of which most Indian autobiographies, Indian biographies, certainly Indian autobiographies, tend to be very hypocritical. And although I think my autobiography contains many more profound thoughts, that's the one that has sold the book.
I'm glad that I don't have to talk about the sex, which of course, Girish, is much profounder than anything else, but we'll leave that. You asked about the nation.
Yes, I'm sort of trying to suggest that the act of writing one's life, as you both have done, now within a year of each other, is also a coming of age moment in a sense, yeah, coming of an older age perhaps. And I'm wondering if there is a similar coming of age in our public domain, in our public sphere, in our idea of ourselves as a nation.
The answer is I have absolutely no idea. I thought of writing the autobiography because before memory starts playing more tricks than it normally does, so that as you get older. So I was not consciously thinking of the nation at all. But of course, there are, since the lives coincide with the nation, there were many interesting kind of things which did happen, which, for instance, when you look at terrorism now, and when our first hijacking took place of a plane, it was a Sikh terrorism in the Punjab. We had no terrorism thing at all, no police, nothing. So I was called by Rajiv, I think Rajiv Gandhi was the General Secretary at that time from the office, that these two Sikh terrorists have hijacked the plane from, I don't know from where, and are taking it to Pakistan, and we are sending you a plane, and you get up there and negotiate with them. They had no idea of what a negotiator is. I had no idea what a negotiator is. They thought I am a Punjabi, they are Punjabis, I could talk Punjabi with them. But their Punjabi was, of course, the rural Punjabi of Jalandhar, which I wouldn't have understood a word. So here I was rushing around with the jeep. The police came to take me to the airport. But luckily, by the time I reached the airport, they had already surrendered at Amritsar. And I was so relieved. So of course, these kind of things. And then, of course, this special police force, special protection group and all. We had no such thing. Again, I was asked, can you do some kind of testing of, we have to create an elite protection force. So I didn't know what kind of test to create. I used the ones which were available and found that there were 90% who failed the IQ test. So what to do about them? So all those were kind of explained, but there's no other story.
Okay, questions from the House? Lots and lots and lots.
Let me just add one thing. One problem I had is to what to call the form. It's memoirs, autobiographies. These are all English words. They come very simply. In Kannada, what to call it was really a problem. And the usual term used in Kannada, as in Marathi, is Atma Katha. Atma is auto and Katha is story, so story about oneself. I decided to call it Atma Kathegalu. And immediately, Katha is the Kannada form of Katha. Katha is the Sanskrit form. And as my friend Giredi Govindraj, who's somewhere here, pointed out immediately, you don't join a Sanskrit word, Atma, with the Kannada word, Katha. It's a sort of, what would you call Arisamasa, enemy conjunction. You either have a Kannada words or you have two Sanskrit words together. But I thought that actually explains my difficulty, which is, one had a sort of given term and one was trying to translate it and one was trying to coin a word. So ultimately I called it a plural then, Galu, the memoirs. So that So as I said, to write an autobiography in Kannada, in India, you have to create your own language because we don't have that tradition at all. And Sudhir, in fact, was who... do you mind if I misquote you? Okay. In one of his books says that Indians don't see each other in terms of individualism, but in relationalism. You know, you are seen as a son, as a father, a good mother, a good son, which in fact is an attitude which is completely anti-autobiography, because in an autobiography you see yourself as a complete being which is worth exploring. And if you're as a result of which immediately you write an autobiography, there are protests from the family. You know, no, it's maybe that you are being honest, but you know, the family doesn't approve of it. You know, what will the others think of us? You know, this kind of thing. So this is a very serious problem. You have to create a language of autobiography if you are writing in Kannada.
But you're right about the protests of the family. In my case, they were absolutely silent. They didn't. And the thing is, the people who are mentioned in the memoirs protest are unhappy, and who are not mentioned are also unhappy. So,
okay, we have 5 minutes, and I'm afraid it's going to be might is right. Whoever has the microphone has the right to speak. So Mike is right, not might is right. Sorry, bad joke. So who has the mic?
Sorry, yeah.
Can't hear you. Okay, I think I got the question. Can I just repeat it for Sudhir, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong? Yeah? I think you're going to have to stop.
I can't hear a thing. Loudly. Why don't you start?
The question, no, hang on just a moment. The question is, why focus on memory and not on dreams? Because both of them are not real. They are not here and not now.
Well, memories and dreams are two different things. Actually, dreams, I mean, you're right, dreams are very important. After all, we spend 6 years of our lives dreaming, so it's 6 years of our lives lost if we do not think of dreams. And if people can include their dreams in their autobiographies, as I think some people can and have done, they're extremely important. Most important, of course, are the major dreams, dreams at junctions of our lives. But memories are the one which we can consciously remember. Dreams are, I'm afraid, we forget immediately, or most of us forget immediately after waking. If you want to remember your dream, don't open your eyes for 20 seconds before when you wake up. That will make you remember that. So the thing is about really forgetting. Dreams you forget, memories you can dredge up. And those are what you know about yourself is really about, is through memories. It is really not important what happens to us, what we think has happened to us, which control our behavior, which make us act as we do. It's only our memories which make it, not the facts.
I think here again the question of language comes in, I think. Once I started writing in Kannada, memories poured out as they wouldn't have hadn't in English.
Also, Girish, once you mentioned a long time ago when you, I think, started writing this memoir, you said that you're writing about the first half of your life in Kannada, and perhaps the second part of your life you write about in English, which I also thought was a very, very important distinction.
Actually, the autobiography I have written so far stops when I'm 34 years old, 34, 35 years old. And I actually wanted to call it Ardha Kathanak. As you probably know, Ardha Kathanak is the first autobiography written in India, written by someone called Banarasi Das, who was a Jain merchant, who called it Ardha Kathanak, which means half a tale, because he wrote it when he was 55, and Jains believe that a human being can go on till 110. So he was given tale. When I wrote this, I was 36, and now I'm nearly 74, so I thought it could be half my tale.
In the front. Yeah. Please keep it very short.
Yeah. Mr. Kakar, I've read your biography and I enjoyed it immensely. What I want to ask you is that after this lapse of time since you wrote it, can you comment on the intellectual honesty of your autobiography?
Question to an analyst.
Why intellectual? I mean, just the honesty of it. I mean, okay. Yeah. You know, no, I think, as I said at the beginning, that there is no way that the self-deceptions won't occur there. I mean, you try your best, but there are times when the pressures to conceal are much, much stronger, especially when other people are involved. And that, I think, is Graham Greene, who said, you have a copyright on your own life, but you will infringe you can't infringe the copyright on others' lives. And that was always a problem of how much. And that is where the honesty part. I was prepared to be honest, but there is also the other value of being fair. How much can you infringe? But I think I was lucky that I could be honest, because I have no government position, I have nothing to aim for, to give, etc. So you can be honest when there are no pressures on you. Not very large families also who are going to protest. They are all dead. So.
Okay, I'm going to keep a gender balance by inviting a gentleman to ask a question.
Hi Girish, this is a question for you. Actually, I read Arartha Aisha. I'm a Kannadiga. Day one I read it, and the question is why you stopped at the half of it. That's Ardha Kathanak. Why you made it Ardha Kathanak?
Well, I got married at that point.
Oh, then no, because I know a little more than that. The thing is,
and literally,
okay,
the question asked by her applies there, because I married to a woman with whom I speak only English. Although we know between us, we know about 7 Indian languages between us, but we only speak to each other in English. So my entire language of communication changed from Kannada or Konkani, which it was, to English with my wife and my children and so on. So in a way, that point is also a point of switch of languages. If I wrote a second half, I would write in English, I think.
So one more question, please. The lady who's waving, your enthusiasm wins you the right to ask a question.
First of all, welcome to Jaipur. And
Keep it short, yes, please.
Secondly, it is nice to hear that 64 years of our independence and the male psyche still gets scintillated by the sexy legs.
64 years of independence and the male psyche in our nation still gets titillated by sexy legs. Gentlemen? Okay, Girish.
Why 64? I'm 74. I still get titillated. Now what do you do?
Girish, you are in so much trouble today. First you said I stopped writing because I got married. Now he says he likes sexy legs. But I will... please.
No, I didn't know whether that was an accusation or a compliment.
Okay. Girish, would you still like to read, or shall we end on a...
Well, I'll just read.
Okay.
Because this has drawn a lot of comment, this is, I should really have started with this. This is just a page. Yeah, I won't go on for this. This is the dedication to Arshia. That's my autobiography. Well, I'll just read it quickly. It's a quick translation. The dedication reads, the year was 1973. I was having lunch with my parents. My film Samskara had won the President's Gold Medal. Vamsha Ruksha had been chosen for the National Award for Direction. I had already got the Sangeet Natak Academy Award and had been appointed director of the Film and Television Institute of India. So the whole house was brimming with self-congratulations. Suddenly, halfway through the lunch, my mother looked at my father and said, and we almost decided not to have him. Father blushed scarlet and hid his head in the plate, in the thali. But my curiosity was excited, and I asked them, but what was that about? I mean, what happened? Tell me. And my father said, well, that's what she decided. I had nothing to do with it. So when I insisted, my mother said, well, you know, we were in Pune, and when I was expecting you, I felt I was then 3 months pregnant. We decided we had enough children, 3 children already, and that we didn't want one more. So I said, what happened? We went to the clinic of a doctor called Dr. Madhumalati Gune, and then I said, nothing happened. We waited for the doctor to come, and the doctor didn't turn up. We waited for half an hour, and then we went home. And then, we never went back, so we changed our mind. I was then 34 years old, yet the notion that the world might be without me made no sense at all. I could not visualize a universe bereft of me. So I sat there for a couple of minutes in total silence. Then another horrifying thought occurred to me, and I said, but what about my younger sister? I said, I mean, if you didn't want me, what about her? So my mother coyly said, oh, by that time we had decided to let things be. So this book owes its existence to the fact that Dr. Madhumalati Gune of Pune never turned up for that wedding. This is therefore dedicated with grateful thanks to the memory of that Dr. Madhumalati Gune.
That's amazing. Sudhir, a final word, and then we'll wrap up. Would you like to say? Would you like a final word?
Would I like
a final word?
No. Except that I don't know if you know, but Girish and I share the same birth year. We were born the same year, 1938.
Well, thank you both very much. That was exciting, scintillating, funny, thoughtful, everything that one could ask of an hour at the Jaipur Literary Festival. So thank you both very much. Thank you all for being here. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, there's an important announcement. The next session, Lucknow Boy, is now being moved to Mughal Tent.